His first press conference was amazing.
Who, Marius?
Yeah, because there were you expect to see all the sleazeballs there, and there were only about 3 or 4, 2 Greeks from Astoria, I think, and a rabbi with a congratulations cake.
Now we'll talk. I've done this in 7 years.
You did it yesterday,
It's
liar.
fun.
I was with you, I saw it.
It's fun.
Okay, you rolling?
Yep.
Go ahead.
You've watched Hugh Carey as governor, principally, for the last 8 years, his 2 terms. And if you've taken the Carey experience, the Carey years, and kind of boiling them down to a nugget, if you can, what do you think has been his contribution to the people of the state of New York in his term as governor?
Well, primarily it was putting the state together with a great deal of strength and, if not bravado, at a time when it seemed to be on the brink of bankruptcy along with the city. Let's start it again.
Go ahead.
You don't need the question.
No, because I'm not going to use it.
Yeah. Mainly, I guess, it's the strength that he showed at a time of great crisis, the fiscal crisis, when he managed to save both the state and the city from bankruptcy. He gathered a lot of fine minds around him. He communicated this strength to the people of New York State and of New York City, and he gave us a very important lift in terms of leadership at a time when we needed it most.
What, if you were to list maybe a couple or 3 qualities that he brought to that task, and then what followed, what would you put at the top of the list in sort of in sequence? Strength you've mentioned, okay. What's beyond that?
Well, his ability to find talent, people like Felix Roeden, to advise him and put together a financial package that made sense. His ability to negotiate with the labor leaders and get them to give up their members' hard-earned money at a time when it was needed, or at least to invest it in the future of the state and the city. I remember the case of Albert Shanker and how he resisted on behalf of the teachers' union until the last minute, and somehow, I believe, memory fails me on the details, they met at someone's apartment, and he finally seemed to persuade Shanker to go along, and the package came together. And that was a very memorable day and hour, and we knew, although we weren't there, to feel the arm or arms being twisted, we realized that this was a very persuasive and forceful figure.
After the fiscal crisis, that's where most folks tend to focus, because that was really the sort of early high point of the administration, and then there was a sort of coasting that happened after that. And all the stuff about him being bored in office with the day-to-day details and was best in a crisis. Do you think that he was able to bring any kind of continuity through the remainder of his 2 terms?
Well, I think that just as it happens with many people elected to public office, in some ways Hugh Carey was his own worst enemy. He managed to turn off a lot of people in the state. They perceived him as well, Jimmy Breslin, his former friend, called him Society Carey, and I think a lot of the public felt that he was, to some extent, a dilettante in office. And yet, obviously, he was a very bright, if not brilliant man, who managed to have the right subordinates there. And the store was always being minded. Barb Morgado was a very powerful figure and obviously knew a lot about managing the affairs of the state. He reported to the governor. The governor had a knack for choosing the right people for the big jobs, and to that extent he was a highly capable executive, despite the personality quirks that may have undermined him in the public mind. I don't know how much that bothered him. I imagine if he was a normal human being, and I think he is, it bothered him a lot, although he didn't show it.
You think, this is an unfair question, okay, because of where you sit, but do you think the, what seemed to be the preponderance of interest in the personality quirks and the foolishness that would pop up, was it overblown?
I don't think it was overblown. I think that, being a member of the press, the electronic side, although I worked the other side of the street in my early days, there's a hunger for news of the chief executive of the state of New York. And if it ain't there, reporters, the Rat Pack is going to go sniffing around for anything they can get. And we are a democracy, and it's not just technicians that we're interested in human beings. And to the extent that you Carey's personal life or his activities outside of the office became known, it was another piece in the mosaic of understanding the governor and understanding what was happening. And people identify with stories about other people, even if they're the governor or the mayor or whoever they are. So I think that people in public life are fair game. It may be that some reporters, some writers may not be fair themselves, and that's our ethics that are at fault. But I think that it wasn't overblown. If it was the only game in town, what Hugh Carey was doing at P.J. Clark's or where he was, or whether he was on Shelter Island or not up in Albany, all these things were fair game because there wasn't anything else. The dentist, the PCBs, all this stuff became fascinating because of the people who were charged with covering him were looking for information of any kind. So I think to that extent, he was fair game, as Bob Wagner said, and Harry Truman said, and many others have said. If you don't want the job, you shouldn't run for it. Wagner always used to say, and Wagner was and is the governor's good friend. I'm talking about Wagner Sr., that my dad used to tell me that if you don't want this job, that was the old senator, there are 10,000 other people out there who want it. So don't cry about the job.
If we could go down the road now about 5 years and Hugh Carey sort of fades into the background, but his name comes up a while from now, or he shows up in some item in the paper, and it triggers a memory in your mind. What do you think that memory will be?
The sparkling blue eyes, the wit, quick mind. He was fun to cover. He didn't know what witticism would come out next. The strength, the moral strength of this man who took unpopular positions on the death penalty, notably on the IRA, on abortion. He did what he thought was right. And I think that's what I'll remember about Hugh Carey, that with all the personal foibles and everything else, when he recedes into history, that this was a man who had courage and who stuck up for what he believed in. He was true to himself. And the personal quirks and the various exploits on Shelter Island and elsewhere will kind of fade from memory.
One of his very close early associates made the comment that because he believed personally that the death penalty was wrong and some of the other issues that were politically unpopular, that he saved politics because he was able, as the chief elected official of the state, to bring to the fore his own personal moral integrity and beliefs. Is that an overstatement, do you think? Because it certainly goes beyond Carey's to save politics.
Yeah, I think that that's an overstatement, but it indicates a very loyal friend, and I admire that quality in men and women. And I think that certainly the contribution that he and other people that I've observed in history, in my relatively brief association with historic figures like governors and mayors, he brought an integrity to politics as far as his position on the death penalty and various other things where he stood up against the forces of public opinion. The majority want the death penalty, and he said, no, I don't want it. And he was ready to risk becoming unpopular over that, and it probably contributed to the unpopularity that I'm sure he felt toward the end of his administration. But there are other figures like that. people of principle like Millicent Fenwick, who lost, and Mario Cuomo, who won. So I think there are quite a few people out there who have the capacity to save politics, standing up to the media gurus who you, Carey, and Ed Koch, and Mario Cuomo have also followed at times. But I think that the real beat, the moral beat that they follow, that drum beat, there are still people, thank God, who are around who do that. And I think that they're all saving politics to the extent that he showed that you could stand up for principle and remain in power. I think he deserves credit.
Okay. Go to business, right? What? We can go to business. We can do this?
Yeah, okay.
My tie, okay? Yes.
Fine.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
From your experience watching and staying in touch with Hugh Carey during his gubernatorial years, 75 to 82, what do you think has been his contribution to the Empire State?
Well, I think he's, I mean, high among his contributions have to be the fact that he kept the state financially solvent. But he did it while keeping his eye on the needs of poor people and lower middle income people. He kept the human services delivered to people that needed them in New York State, and I think he did that in a variety of ways. In the health area, he put through the most progressive cost containment, hospital cost containment programs in the country. But he still got health care out there to people that needed it. He moved to reform the welfare system to the furthest extent the federal government would permit it. But he still got payments out there to people that needed them. And I think in that sense, he made a contribution that was quite distinct. In an era in which every state in the Union faced budget squeezes, he managed to keep the human services flowing in New York, the state that probably faced the greatest budget squeeze while he was governor.
What, if you were to list some qualities that he brought to his job and was able to accomplish the things maybe you just put forward, what qualities would be high on the list, do you think?
Mostly he knew how to make the system work. He knew how to get businessmen and labor people and government people and doctors, and he knew how to get people to get something done. That's probably the most critical attribute for a governor or any chief executive to have, and he had it. And it's much more difficult in political life than it is in business life. He knew where all the political forces were. He knew how strong they were, how weak they were, and he knew how to get them to work together, along with the private and economic forces that you need to get working if you're going to get a state or any organization of a public kind working.
Mm-hmm. Let's look ahead if we can and be predictive historians. And maybe 5 or 10 years down the road, an item in the paper shows up, Hugh Carey's name comes up in conversation, and your memory bank of him is jogged. What's the first sort of remembrance that will come to the surface then, you think, your favorite remembrance?
Well, my first remembrance of Hugh Carey was when he was a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, when Lyndon Johnson was president, and we were trying to pass the great Elementary and Secondary Education Act legislation that provided money to elementary and secondary schools all across this country. Adam Clayton Powell, another New Yorker, was chairman of the committee, and Powell was very difficult to get, to deal with. He was out of the country a lot. And Lyndon Johnson called Powell, and he asked him to get Hugh Carey designated as the person for the White House to deal with on that law. And in those days, when you had the key member of the majority party on the committee, you had the committee. And Carey became the negotiator for the Congress. And Carey and members of the White House staff holed up in a room. President Johnson wouldn't let anybody out until there was an agreement. And Carey came up with the idea of having parochial schools get leased books, something that 15 years later the Supreme Court held constitutional. And my very distinct memory of Carey is the work he did on that bill. I mean, he was critical. And indeed, after the bill was passed, Lyndon Johnson signed it on Hugh Carey's birthday.
Let's talk just a little bit about what has been focused on by the press, and that is, the Carey personality and the overblown sort of appreciation that came out of, constantly hitting away at the Carey witticisms and characterizing him as vintage Carey, unusual, and the whole rest down the line. What is the essence of the man?
I don't know what the essence of Hugh Carey is. I think the personality issue it really stems from the fact that he's very intelligent, and that as challenging and difficult as the job of being governor of New York is, it wasn't enough to keep him busy all the time. His mind was constantly roving and looking into new areas, and it just wasn't enough to keep him engaged all the time. When he had to be engaged, he was. With the financial crisis, he was engaged. When he had to deal with the state legislature, he was engaged. But when he didn't have to be engaged, his mind just roamed elsewhere.